The Great Steppe, millenniums of events, hundreds of nomadic tribes and people. They lived, worked, made discoveries, conquered large tracts of lands, and left us some mysteries. To learn more about it, watch the project called Enigma of the Great Steppe. In 1940, a guest from Alma-Ata visited a provincial town in the northwest of Kazakhstan. He was busy with an unusual affair. The visitor was inspecting the streets, questioning residents about one of their fellow countrymen, while constantly making some sketches. A few days later, the visitor went back to Alma-Ata. But even there at home, he did not take it easy. For quite some time, he was browsing through the sketches he brought from his business trip, was rereading the notes he took, drew, but this time on canvas, not on paper. The man the artist was asking the residents about was an outstanding person. Even those who are inclined to romanticize this hero admitted that literally any Kazakh could be in his place. This was partially confirmed by the fact that the appearance of the hero was recreated with the combined efforts of the whole country. After that expedition to the distant town, the artist would return to his sketches and notes, go back to that small town again. Something in that story wouldn't let him go. The number of rebels reaches up to 50,000 askers in Torgay and Irgiz districts. For now, they are scattered around Volost, but in the meantime, they attempt to unite in a huge crowd, acting against the cities of Torgay, Irgiz, Karabutak, and the railway line. With the enormous mobility of the Kyrgyz, it is impossible to count on rapid success by delivering quick strikes. It will take at least 1 to 2 years to pacify the region. In 1947, a monument to Amangeldy Imanov was erected in Alma-Ata. A native of the Torgay steppe, he was one of the active participants in the 1916 uprising. In the old days, this man of excellent military qualities and decisive character could be the hero of songs and epic poems. In fact, something similar happened to Amangeldy. It became part of a powerful myth about the brave fighters for Soviet power. The fact that not a single photograph of the man was preserved greatly contributed to the mythologization of his personality. Who could stand behind the legend of the Kazakh Chapayev? What kind of information about Amangeldy made it to our days? And how did the artist Abilkhan Kasteyev capture the history in his drawings? The Torgay rebel, Amangeldy Imanov, will be punished with this shameful death, as well as everyone else who joined him. The Kazakh people, deputies from the authorities, elders, respectable people are telling themselves, drop your weapons, do not listen to Amangeldy. Well, and the text is beautiful. Amangeldy was born in 1873 in one of the villages of Torgay district. He was orphaned at the age of 8. Amangeldy's family was not a prosperous one. As a teenager, he worked as a shepherd for wealthy villagers. In fact, he was an ordinary person who was even illiterate until certain time. It was a common phenomenon in those days. It's just that he had probably an acute sense of justice and certainly possessed certain leadership qualities. Amangeldy's father was called Udurbai, and his grandfather was Iman. Iman was a batyr and military leader with Khan Kenisari Kasimov, but this fact was not widely advertised in Soviet times. In the pre-revolutionary documents, Amangeldy was known as Udurbayev, but later he became better known as Imanov. In Orenburg archive, I found an interesting article in the Torgay Vedomosti, newspaper of 1905. As a matter of fact, Torgay became a fortress, a county town by the initiative of the Tsarist government, meaning that this small county town, it was built mainly by Russians. All the infrastructure was built by them. Accordingly, Russian residents appeared there, who naturally were engaged in agriculture. The Cossacks were exclusively engaged in cattle breeding. And then you see there was some kind of tension. Competition arose at that time, as the Russian population was engaged in gardening. And on this basis, clashes over land started to happen. And since Amangeldy was a fair person, as he considered himself, he thought, "This is our Kazakh land, and you are aliens." This was the psychology. So of course there were clashes. The article is even called that, Skirmish with Russian Gardeners. Amangeldy was not a professional revolutionary. Judging by the very scarce archival information, he was an active, decisive person who was respected by commoners and peasants. A curious story is described in the diaries of the composer Evgeny Brusilovsky. In the 1930s, it was allegedly Stalin himself who told the leaders of the Republic about the Kazakh Chapayev, as if, when Joseph Vissarionovich defended Tsarist in now Volgograd, he was in contact with a large detachment of rebels, commanded by a fearless Kazakh named Amangeldy. It is a strange and very dark situation and story. What did he look like? No one can tell, as if no one had seen him. Even Jangeldyn, to whom Amangeldy was subordinate. There was a photograph featuring three people, Abul Ghaffar in the center, Jangeldyn on the left, and Amangeldy on the right. But the children used to play with it. They tore it up, and it was lost. Thanks to this, we have an idea of what Amangeldy looked like. Based on the description of his character, we were able to reconstruct his image bit by bit. So this is not really a fiction or fantasy, it is a collective image. Imanov's biography is based on the memoirs of his colleagues, relatives, and countrymen. Through collective efforts, a description of the batyr was made. It was not easy for the artist Abelkhan Kasteyev to visualize a verbal portrait of a Torgai native. Dad decided to go and try to draw the portrait, collect the information on Amangeldy Imanov and draw his portrait. You know, everyone was saying different things there. Someone said that he was tall, someone said he was short, someone said he was stout, someone said he was stocky. Descriptions were so different. Dad said he was in despair. He first questioned them one by one, and then he decided to gather them together. He began to question them, and there were such debates, he said. And then someone advised him, "You'd better not ask here. Go to the place he was born, to his native place of birth, and ask there." Well, so he did. There is a village in 200 kilometers from Torgai, and Dad went there. When he went there, indeed, he began to question everyone, and everyone began to tell him what Amangeldy looked like. Then they were giving him some examples. His forehead, for example, it looked just like his son, Amangeldy Imanov's son. But the mustache, for example, a neighbor had the same mustache, while someone had the same eyebrows. So he wrote down and sketched everything, each description separately. And then when he finished his questioning, he decided to create this portrait. He made several portraits, in fact, en face, profile portrait, full body portrait. Then he drew some accessories that Amangeldy had, weapons and so on. At first, the commission arrived in the 40s. The commission came to see whether or not what Dad drew was suitable, and this commission was present when he allowed people into the room, one by one, where he hung up the portraits, and when he was asking these people which portrait was the most realistic. And everyone unanimously said that one of the portraits was very similar to what the man looked like in real life. They confirmed it. And so, this was how Amangeldy Imanov's portrait was created. But only few people saw these drawings made by Kasteyev. They were based on the memoirs of the rebels, or in Kazakh, Amangeldy's Sarbaz. On the back of the drawings as the confirmation are eyewitnesses' signatures. In the absence of newsreels and photographs, this is perhaps the only visual archive of the most dramatic years in the Kazakh history. No wonder that someone once noticed that Kasteyev captured history in his drawings. A little bit later we will come back to this, but in the meantime, we want to say that in Soviet times, Amangeldy was called a rebel, an organizer of the masses, even a peasant revolutionary. Let's forget about ideological cliché and ask the following questions. What prompted thousands of nomads to start armed uprising? Why couldn't Amangeldy stay away from it? How was the rebel movement arranged? And what are these mysterious Khans, mentioning of whom was censored?
Это мнение Тынчпаева. В частности, вот есть у нас...
This is not my opinion. This is Tinishbayev's opinion. In particular, there is a document in which he testified about the 1916 uprising to a local bailiff, and justice of the peace, to whom he explained the reasons for the 1916 uprising. There he mentioned very clearly that the first generation of Russian colonial officials had an understanding of fate and the situation of the Kazakh people. They were keen in their desire to resolve any issues amicably, without causing any exasperations, and therefore there was less bribery in those years. In the next stage, it was the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, the resettlement policy. These were completely different figures. And Tinishbayev wrote about this, saying that that generation was preoccupied only with their personal profit. They corrupted the local population by taking bribes. He says that Russia's policy changed dramatically when the process of implementing the Stolypin reform and the mass resettlement of peasants program began. These were people who were not interested and did not even seek to understand the local population. And this trend continued. The best lands were taken from the nomads. They were forced to rent land from the peasants. The administration did not react to the numerous complaints of the steppe dwellers. In the summer of 1914, the Russian Empire engaged in the First World War. The theater of military operations demanded donations, yurts, sheepskins, and livestock for passing trains. On the eve and during the war, the number of crop areas in Kazakhstan was decreased by 63%. In 1913 to 15s, out of 310,000 horses, only 260,000 remained. Even the Tsarist officials who worked and served during the uprising, they admitted it. For example, there was an officer of the gendarmerie called Jungmeister. He served in the Turkestan Security Department. In his certificate, which he submitted to the higher authorities, he wrote, "The main reasons for the uprising in the Turkestan region are the following. The first is the land issue. The second is the attitude of the Russian administration to the local population, to the natives. They, he said, looked down at them, and the military governors of various regions, including the Torgay and the Jitisu regions, General Falbum in particular, when they made their reports, they also admitted that the land issued remained the most central one. And apart from this, there were different taxes, for example, tilt cart taxes and taxes on different materials. Various material resources, for example, meat, were taken in favor of war." On the 25th of June 1916, the highest command was issued to mobilize the foreigners of the Astrakhan province, Siberia, and Central Asia for labor battalions. About 400,000 men between the ages of 19 and 43 were supposed to be requisitioned for rear work. Moreover, this decree was written in a humiliating form. They called it the requisition of Kazakhs for rear operations, like cattle. And of course, the Kazakhs have human dignity. To use them like this was a sheer humiliation. I have to say that the Kazakhs considered the possibility of participating in the war. Moreover, we had the volunteers who wanted to go to war. Therefore, on the pages of the Kazakh newspaper, the questions of the possibility of mobilizing the Kazakhs in the army, in the Russian army, were raised very often. But the question was whether they will serve in the infantry or in the cavalry. And of course, everyone wanted to be in the cavalry. And the question of whether to participate in the war or not was non-existent. Everyone agreed to participate, but under certain conditions. But they were said, "You will dig trenches, no weapons, you will dig the trenches ahead of the troops, and then you will be killed." They said, "But how can we do all of this without weapons and under fire?" And then for the Kazakhs, poking around in the ground was unnatural. A true nomad touches the ground twice. when he digs a grave or puts out a fire. He doesn't poke in the ground. It is below his dignity. The military decree was the last straw that broke the camel's back. Rebellions broke out in different regions of Kazakhstan and Central Asia. The Tsarist authorities sent punitive detachments to suppress them. Armed units were confronted by people with sabers, hunting and matchlock guns, lances and axes.
Это же движение, оно же было стихийным, оно же не было организованным, оно не было
This movement, it was a spontaneous one. It was not organized, it was not pre-planned. Therefore, of course, they armed themselves with anything they could. And at that time, the role of the Kazakh blacksmiths who forged these weapons was crucial. Frankly speaking, the weapon was primitive in comparison with the professional one of the Russian Cossack troops. And apparently, the fact that it was their land, our land, land of the Kazakhs, who perfectly knew every hill, was crucial. And then, you know, the motivation, as we say today, they fought for themselves, for their jigas, for their fathers, for their sons. And by the way, either in Aman-Tugay or in Amangeldy district, there are so-called watchtowers, from which they monitor the progress of their enemy. In fact, they did not build these towers. These were watchtowers made of wild stones that were built by someone else, maybe in the Middle Ages, maybe in the Stone Age, but they were preserved quite well, and the rebels used them for these purposes. Along with Amangeldy, his countryman Alebi Jangeldin, who was a professional revolutionary, is often mentioned. Perhaps their picture, as rumors had it, actually existed. But then who was the third person in the photograph? Someone related to the Torgay uprising? And now a historical fact. In 1916, in the Torgay steppe, the uprising was started by Abdi Gapar Jan Bosinov. It was the biggest rebellion of 1916. And Amangeldy Imanov was appointed commander-in-chief, Sardar of these troops. Why Amangeldy, and why Imanov was his surname? Iman, his grandfather, he was one of Kenisari Kasima's military leaders. He was a Sardar too. This was the high command of the uprising. Then Alebi Jangeldin appeared. He was a fellow countryman of Amangeldy Imanov. They were coming from one clan, the Kipchaks. How did this happen? How Amangeldy engaged him in this rebellion? Amangeldy accepted the Bolshevik ideas and broke off from the rebellion. Then the history, as it happens, was edited, and Amangeldy Imanov became the leader of the uprising. By the way, Abdi Gapar Jan Bosinov, he was a common Cossack. Only the descendants of Genghis Khan were appointed Khans, so he was not a Genghis-Hid. But since the concept of leadership, leader was invested in the word Khan. Abdi Gapar Jan Bosinov was the Khan. So there was a Khan in the ranks of the Torgay rebels. Moreover, leaders in various parts of the steppe were endowed with this high dignity.
Вначале было как-то стихийное выступление, а потом пошла уже самоорганизация.
At first it was a spontaneous rebellion, and later it became self-organized. And those people who were famous and respected in their communities, bees, for example, people elected them Khans at different gatherings and meetings. For example, Zharminkia Mambetov was born in 1838 and was 78 years old at the period of the uprising. He was also elected leader of the uprising. Bekbolat Ashikeyev was 73 years old. He was also elected Khan. One of the Genghis-Hids who was elected, the son of Tizek Ablaykhanov, Hudayr Khan Ablaykhanov. He was elected Khan in the Kapal region. In Soviet historiography, they were not mentioned at all. And if they were mentioned, it was in a negative sense. It was said that they did not rebel for the sake of the people, but that they were defending their property. I've studied various documents. There were news sources that have not been published before, and there it was written clearly that they defended the interests of the common people and not just their own. The Sarbaz with whom the artist Abilkhan Kasteyev spoke described not only the battles with punitive detachments, but also how the uprising of 1916 was replaced by the Civil War.
Очень много зарисовок, какие события проходили у отца, например, когда...
My father had a lot of sketches about what events took place in the steppe. For example, the capture that happened, the armed rebellion that was organized by Amangeldy, when he won, and when they were captured, sieged in the building. Then how he was taken prisoner, how they were shot. All of this Dad drew in small sketches. And on the back of each drawing that Dad made, there were signatures in Latin graphics. All of this was in the 1939.
Вот такой вот...
Wanting to stop the robberies, I gathered old men of both parties in Torgay and invited them to put an end to mutual civil claims peacefully. Abdul Ghaffar and Amangeldy, not wanting to take part in the meeting, left Torgay. Their arrest is required in order to pacify the country. Because of them, I keep 400 Cossacks in the country. I ask for your permission to arrest Abdul Ghaffar and Amangeldy and keep them arrested until the explanations of the meaning of amnesty and freedom of employment to his supporters will be made, for which I will be sending special people to Torgay district. After the arrest of Abdul Ghaffar and Amangeldy, Cossack hundreds will be returned to the front. By 1918, Imanov took the side of the Bolsheviks and was appointed military commissar of the Torgay district. He refused to obey the commissioner of the provisional government for the Torgay region, Alikhan Bukekhanov, the head of the Alash Orda government. After the occupation of Torgay by the Alash Orda people, Amangeldy was arrested and shot. He was in prison for some time. They tried to bring him parcels and so on. But he was in prison for a very short period of time because there was no time for ceremonies, no time to properly consider his case, because the military actions continued. It was necessary to go further. Therefore, without any ceremonies, they shot him very quickly. This was a difficult time, a tragic confrontation. The Civil War passed through every family. In one family, brothers could fight against each other. Therefore, this was a tragedy, and it is necessary to write things based on actual data. There were irreconcilable enemies, and irreconcilable enemies are most often in the Civil War. Such a tragedy has happened in our history. In Soviet times, Alash Orda followers were called enemies of the people. In independent Kazakhstan, they were rehabilitated. As for Amangeldy, modern scholars do not diminish his merits in the uprising of 1916, considering him a victim of the political situation and the Civil War. The fate of many rebels was no less tragic than that of their leader. After the Civil War, they became the object of forced settlement and collectivization. Their resentment grew into armed resistance. For the Soviet regime, the heroes of the uprising of 1916 turned into bandits. According to the research of the respected professor, Talas Omarbekov, there were 372 large and small rebellions across Kazakhstan during the period of collectivization from 1929 to 1931. And more than 80,000 people participated in these uprisings. And some participants of the 1916 uprising participated in the uprising of the 1930s. These were common peasants, Sharua, who had nothing to do with politics. They defended their families, their household, their home, and they were accused of banditry, and many of them have not been rehabilitated still. The expedition of the 1940s to the Torgay steppes was aimed to restore the picture of the uprising of 1916 and to recreate the appearance of the national hero, Amangeldy Imanov. But the artist, Abilkhan Kasteyev, and the expedition participants achieved greater things. The bygone era was captured in their drawings and other collected field materials. The life of the Kazakhs, their anthropological characteristics, the details of the nomadic way of life, the features of traditional culture, all this remained in its original form in the middle of the 20th century. But very soon, it sank into oblivion.